Good morning, everybody. It's a bit early this morning. For technical reasons, it's going to be noisy in my house at 10:30. So we're doing the Facebook Live now, and the lady of the week that we're going to talk about is Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is the mother of John the Baptist, and Luke starts his gospel talking about Elizabeth and what's happening with Elizabeth and Zechariah. So it's the very beginning of the gospel story for Luke. And Luke is always portrayed as someone who is prepared to listen and write down the testimony of women. So he does this starting off the story, and it's the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary. It's all tied together. It's quite a long bit, so what would be really useful for you to do is to read the whole of Luke 1. I'm going to dip in and out of bits of Luke 1 for today, but if you read the whole of Luke 1, it gives the kind of précis and purpose of why Luke's writing his gospel at the beginning. And then it starts with this bit saying the birth of John the Baptist is foretold. So this is what it looks at. So Zechariah was a priest. It gives you a little bit of his priestly lineage, and then it talks about Elizabeth, his wife, and then it says both of them were righteous before God, living blamelessly according to all the commandments and regulations of the Lord, but they had no children because Elizabeth was barren and both were getting on in years. And then it talks about Zechariah going into the temple. It's a kind of choice by lot to go into the temple, whose job it was. So Zechariah goes in and he makes the offering, and then an angel appears with a kind of, Zechariah, I've been waiting for you, and explains to Zechariah that they're going to have a child. The angel says, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you will name him John." That's really radical. That's incredibly radical. They shouldn't call a child John. A child should be called Zechariah. John means the grace of the Lord. So that's quite a radical thing. Then Zechariah has a bit of an argument with the angel, and the angel says, well, since you didn't believe me, you are not going to be able to speak until the baby is born. So Zechariah then comes out from his offering in the sanctuary, and he can't speak. Then it goes on in verse 24 to say, after those days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she remained in seclusion. She said, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favourably on me and took away the disgrace I have endured among my people." So then we have a break in the story in Luke 1 where Gabriel goes to see Mary. Okay, Gabriel appears to see Mary and says, when Mary says, "How can this possibly happen?" Gabriel says, How has Elizabeth had a baby? How has this happened? How has Elizabeth had a baby? And then Mary goes to see Elizabeth. So I think this is really interesting because Elizabeth is too old. She's too old, she's too barren, she can't have a child, and yet she's pregnant. Gabriel uses this as evidence. So Mary goes to see Elizabeth. In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town in the hill country, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the child leapt in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit and exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why has this happened to me, that the mother of my Lord comes to me? For as soon as I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leapt for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." So Elizabeth speaks this great prophecy for Mary as Mary arrives. Mary sings the Magnificat at that point, and at this point we can see that both of these women have understood God's plan. It will take men quite a long time to get the hang of what's going on here, but both of these women have already understood God's plan. Zechariah at the moment may have understood God's plan, but he can't tell anybody about it because the angel was annoyed with him, and now he can't speak because he didn't trust what the angel was saying as the message from the Lord. And Mary remained about 3 months with Elizabeth and then returned home. That's quite important. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth. This is verse 57. And she bore a son. Her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown his great mercy to her, and they rejoiced with her. On the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him Zechariah after his father, but his mother said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "None of your relatives has this name." Then they began motioning to his father to find out what name he wanted to give him. He asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John." And all of them were amazed. Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue freed, and he began to speak, praising God. Fear came over all their neighbours, and all these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. All who heard them pondered them and said, "What then will this child become? For indeed the hand of the Lord was with him." Then, now Zechariah can speak, Zechariah gives his prophecy, his song, to talk about God's plan. Zechariah talks about God's plan at that point. After Mary has already talked about God's plan to Elizabeth, then everyone believes Zechariah, and the cynics among you may say that that's because Zechariah was mansplaining. But there we go. I really like Elizabeth. She's one of my favourite people in the Bible, and I'm not sure exactly why I like her so much, but there are all sorts of little intimate details in this story that Luke, kind of the physician, the doctor, the person who understands people and what goes on with their bodies, explains or just talks about quite frankly in a way which we don't often get. So Mary stays with Elizabeth for 3 months. By that time she really knows that she is pregnant, and that she's not just having a delusion of the angel. She really is pregnant at that point. 3 months in, she really knows what's beginning to happen with her body, and she's been with this holy woman, and these holy women have been able to support each other at this time. What I really has always intrigued me, and why I quite like Zechariah as well, is that Zechariah is like, "We're old, we can't do this. What do you think we can do?" But there's no indication in Luke's account that anyone should think of John the Baptist as an immaculate conception. So Zechariah went home and did something about this prophecy. And I think that's quite important for us. When we ever think that God is calling us to do something, we will probably have to do something about it. And Zechariah did that, and Elizabeth conceived. He had that hope that actually he and God and Elizabeth were in this together. I like Elizabeth because she supports Mary, she understands Mary, and she believes Mary, and she is already part of this plan that God has, and they see God's mercy acting through what's happening to them, and that's really interesting and supportive. We all have people in our lives who have been there in that situation to speak wise words to us. Sometimes they're older than us, sometimes they're younger than us, but it shows that kind of bond of togetherness, but also that willingness to listen to what God is doing together. Every time I read this story, this narrative, I realise that Luke has said something or not said something, but is important. So there are a couple of things that have struck me when I've been preparing for today. One is that I think Elizabeth must have been able to read. And I've never thought about this before, and it may be that I need to check with some scholar about this. But if Zechariah couldn't speak when he came home from the temple, how did Elizabeth know that the baby's name is John if Zechariah hadn't been able to speak to her if she couldn't read? So I don't know that. That's just struck me today, that maybe Elizabeth was actually quite an educated person, quite someone who was part of that tribe. I mean, they were priestly people, but I've never thought about that before. I shall have to ask somebody who knows a lot more about New Testament studies than me about whether that is what's implied, because Zechariah couldn't have told her. And the other thing which has struck me is that that part of this preparation for John the Baptist and part of the as the forerunner for Jesus is also to do with this thing. So everybody knows what's happened. Everybody knows what's happened to Zechariah and to Elizabeth. It's a very public thing. The whole kind of his name is John and writing it on the tablet, and it actually talks about this. It says, fear came over all their neighbours, and these things were talked about throughout the entire hill country of Judea. So this is part of the story. And then we come to the birth of Jesus, which is presumably about 5 or 6 months later, depending on how the dates exactly worked out. So Jesus is born, and then we get the story of the shepherds. And I've never thought about this before. So the shepherds already know that God is up to something, because they would have heard the gossip about Elizabeth and Zechariah. So they will have heard this kind of, what's happening? What is God doing? What is happening to these people? So when the angels appear to the shepherds, it's in the context in this gospel that the angels have already appeared twice in the story. They've appeared to Zechariah, who was like, are you sure? Really? And then to Mary, who has a kind of, well, if you say so, I will do what God is asking me. And then when it comes to the shepherds, they're not asked to have a baby. They're just asked to go and see a baby that is born. And so they're already aware that God is on the move. Now they have to wait 30-ish years before John starts his ministry. But that time, what will happen in those stories? What will happen in those things that are going on? What will happen in their minds? Will they talk to their children about what was happening on the hillside? Will the children know about the special boy John and the funny, I bet he was teased, but what happens to him? What happens because he's the special boy that God has chosen? I think somebody wrote a story about that not all that long ago, about being the special one. John grows up into the special one, and so does Jesus. When one of the things I like about Elizabeth and Mary is that they're getting God's plan. They're talking about God's plan right at the very beginning of it. They understand the story. Zechariah is involved. Joseph, I could talk about Joseph for a long time, but there's that little phrase, isn't there, that someone wrote in a poem not that long ago. Joseph, the godfather of God. Interesting way that we think about Joseph. But in Killearn, in the window, you're not really supposed to go into that bit of the church at the moment, but when we can go in a bit more, I'll put it, I've got a photo of it somewhere, I'll put it on Facebook. There's a picture of Elizabeth and Mary and the Holy Spirit, and so they're both pregnant at that point, because it's supposed to be that point at which John is kicking, going, this is it, he's here with Mary. And it's a long time since I was pregnant now, but I do remember that whole weird thing about how weird being pregnant is. I mean, it's a female superpower, but it is weird, and that kind of this child kicking thing going on. So the window has Mary and Elizabeth and the Holy Spirit, also contains Jesus and John the Baptist, but we can't see them yet. But these women know that they're there, they're filled with the Holy Spirit, and they understand what's going on. So Elizabeth, one of my favourite people in the Bible, and I just love the way that she and Zechariah worked together. She welcomed Mary, she understood what God was up to. So Elizabeth today, and then next week we're going to think about Mary and what that means. So thank you for joining me this morning. So next week we're going to think about Mary, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.